Okay, well, I'm really excited and happy to be here today. I was in Queensland more than 30 years ago. When I was an undergraduate, I did a semester here in marine biology, and that helped me realize that I didn't want to be a marine biologist, but that I loved terrestrial ecology. And the first rainforest I ever went to was in Lamington, and even though the leeches were crawling up my legs, I knew right then, I was like, this is what I want to study. This is what I want to do. So I kind of got bit by the leech, metaphorically, and have been really excited about working in rainforests ever since. So I'm going to talk today about our work in Hawaii, and I'll just get right to it. So just for people that are not familiar, for people that are not familiar, here's Hawaii off of the coast of the US, about 4,000 kilometers. And I'm coming here from Hawaii Island, which is also called the Big Island, from the east side, Hilo. And we have the Kilauea volcano, which this is a picture I took in January. And this is my office. If you can see a faint rainbow, that happened one day. So I thought I would share that. And also, in Hawaii, it's very common when you meet people to talk about your moku au hau, your genealogy. So I wanted to just share that with you today. I grew up in Chicago, and at the top photo there is my two sets of grandparents and myself on the right, and that's my younger sister, right? And she's here today. So we're both here in this photo. And then my academic moku au hau is I was a bachelor's degree in a small college in Minnesota. And then my PhD was at University of Florida, and my supervisor was Jack Putz, who I think some of you know. And then I did a postdoc that was joint through UC Berkeley and the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, which is the US Forest Service. And my three mentors were Wendy Silver, Ariel Lugo, and Fred Scatina. And I want to also mention that everything that I'm talking about today is this amazing team effort. There's many people that have been involved with the project at all different levels. So on this list are people that have come out just for a day or two just to help out and see what it's about, people that have been long-term technicians, and groups. We've had lots of groups come out, lots of classroom groups, school groups, elementary school, etc. So it's really no shock to any of us about the human domination of our landscapes, and that we're part of this Anthropocene era, and that we now have these landscapes where we have the historical, more native dominated systems butting against very novel systems with new species mixes, agricultural production, and urban landscapes. And these landscapes do have contact with lots of non-native species. And for today's talk, I'm going to focus on the non-native species that are not the invasive ones. So the difference that I'm going to hit upon is the harm that's done. And we tend to colloquially think of all non-native species as invasive, but there's many non-native species that do not play a harmful role in the ecosystem. And so what I'm talking about today are situations where new restoration strategies are needed under several different conditions. And one is where we have novel systems, and where these novel ecosystems that have mixes of completely new species, they've crossed some kind of threshold whereby it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort to get back to this historical system, and they may never able to get back. And then I'm also going to be focusing on these hybrid systems, which are mixes of the historical components, the native species that were there, and some of these new species, these non-native species. And in certain cases, we need new models, new restoration strategies, because we've crossed this threshold and they require our help. Now they're not going to get back. Hawaii is a really extreme example of that. We've lost most of our native seed dispersers on Hawaii Island, where I live. There's only one native seed disperser left, the oma'o, the thrush, that's in the wild. And there's one other species, the alala, the Hawaiian crow, that's in captivity, that's been released to the wild several different times that have failed still continuing to try, but we don't really have the dispersers either to allow all these natural processes to occur. And then the other case when new restoration strategies may be needed are when we have reference systems that are very problematic. And we have systems that lack historic data and future conditions where there's going to be non-analog climates. Hawaii is one of these cases where we do not really have good reference systems in some of the ecosystems. I'm going to give some more examples of that. So my interests lie in these hybrid ecosystems at this end of being self-assembled versus more human-centered. And I didn't really want to start working on this necessarily, but being in Hawaii, this has become sort of like a lifetime of work. So over the last 22 years that I've been here, it's sort of evolved. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is this collective ideas that have been percolating for a long time that we've worked into these experiments. I didn't start to want to work on invasive species. That wasn't like what I dreamed of, but it's really hard not to when you live and work in Hawaii. Just a little bit of background for those that are not familiar. The Hawaiian Islands are the most isolated archipelago on Earth, more than 4,000 kilometers from any continent. And before humans got there, across this whole island chain, which includes the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, on average, about one species would colonize every 30,000 years. Okay? And now we have new species coming in, new plant species, several dozen plant species coming in every year. So the human impact to the environment is pretty extreme. And this invasion led to, is also combined with lots of environmental gradients. We have very strong climatic gradients, very strong elevation gradients up to 4,200 meters, very strong rainfall, and then the soil age with volcanic islands moving across a hot spot and off the hot spot and aging. So we have this tremendous environmental variation, as well as this isolation, which has led to high amounts of endemism. So Hawaii is one of these biodiversity hotspots. 90% of the plants and animals are endemic. And that led to these really unique creatures. Our honey creepers, we have more than 50 species of these unique birds. The Hawaiian silver swords are iconic. But then, of course, we know the story. Humans came, first the early Polynesians, and then later Captain Cook and Westerners came in 1778. That led to the introduction of lots of these pests and invasive species and a lot of extinctions. So this is a common story, but in Hawaii, it's kind of extreme in the sense that we now have 55% of our flora is non-native. We have more non-natives in our flora than natives. That's crazy when you really start to think about the influence of the last about 1,000 years where people have been in the Hawaiian Islands. So I'm going to be talking about this case study in the Hawaiian lowland wet forest. And the wet forest is on the windward side, the northeastern sides of the islands. This map shows pre-contact and post-contact. The pink are human-dominated areas where people are living and where non-native species are. So you can see that there's been a large transformation of the low elevation forests, and the best forest patches are left at higher elevations. So in theory, the regenerative power of tropical wet forest should be high. I don't need to tell this audience this, you live that, but we have some challenges in Hawaii. We have low species diversity because they were so isolated. Even though we have the 90% endemism, we have very low numbers of species, plant species in our forests. As I mentioned, more than half the flora is non-native. We've got lots of extinct seed dispersers. Paradoxically, many of our species, especially our common rainforest canopy tree, ohia, is a very slow grower. And we also have especially on the youngest islands, sites that have little soil development. So we have to ask ourselves some questions for conservation planning. Can we go back to historical conditions, or can we maintain a mostly natural state? And if that answer is yes, then we could potentially maintain our ecosystems as is, or do active restoration where we do planting, or more passive restoration where we remove the threats and see what happens. But if that answer is that we cannot maintain in a mostly natural state, then that comes into these ideas of novel systems, accepting novel systems, or trying to get to a hybrid system where we have both native and some of these novel non-native species growing together. And I'm going to focus on that hybrid system for this talk. And it is a paradigm shift. In Hawaii, we've been doing this for a while, that we really don't get pushback anymore because people have seen the extreme. Other places, this is a newer idea for people to accept some non-native species within the ecosystem mix. But I want to give you an example. I don't know if has anyone been to this site? This is a common tour site on Hawaii Island. It's called Akaka Falls. And it looks very tropical, and it is. But as I mentioned, 90% of our species are endemic. So we grade out everything that's non-native, and you're left with this. Okay. And just down here in this corner here, it's a couple people. So restoring this to an all-native community is just not feasible in terms of time, in terms of effort, labor, money, and all the systems around it are disturbed, and the propagules are just going to come back. And it's not like this is in a native dominated forest area where you can get good seed dispersal back. The landscape context is very disturbed. So the reality is, in Hawaii, we have these invasions that have led to new species mixes, and we cannot do the traditional restoration. We don't have reference sites to go back to. And so we need to embrace this idea that Hobbes had of intervention ecology. And we came up with what we think is a testable solution to look at this, using developing hybrid ecosystems for restoration using native and what I'm going to call exotic, which are non-native, non-invasive species. And we use the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment, and we used our own knowledge to find those species. And we're employing a functional trait approach that I'm going to explain. That led to our project called Liko Nā Pilina. Pilina in Hawaiian means relationships, and Liko is the new growth, new sprouts, new leaves, new buds. So literally, we're growing new relationships among the different plant species or new partnerships. And so our goals are to design hybrid ecosystems that can address the issues in Hawaii and elsewhere in the Pacific, but also an approach using functional traits that's transferable, that really tests some fundamental questions about community assembly. Now, the reason why we're using functional traits is because functional traits are both meaningful and measurable. Plant functional traits influence growth, reproduction, survival, so they get at trade-offs. So just as an example here in this picture, we have different leaves that we collected, and you can see there's differences in leaf color, in leaf shape, in petiole length, teeth. All of these kinds of things are going to affect the nitrogen concentration, the photosynthesis rate, the water use efficiency, things that relate to how a plant makes its living and survives and adapts in the environment. So the next two slides are kind of the most important ones of the whole talk. So I want to spend a little bit of time here. And this is the background on why we decided to do this hybrid ecosystem approach. So we went out in East Hawaii and we chose 35 candidate species, native and these non-native, non-invasive exotic species. And we sampled 15 different functional traits. Things like leaf mass per area, leaf nitrogen, leaf carbon, photosynthesis, water use efficiency, wood density, seed mass, petiole length, etc. And then we put all that information into a principal components analysis. And what we were really surprised that basically you can see these native species here are sort of clustered in one part of the graph. And these non-native species are clustered in another part of the graph. These two native species here that are like this one, this is coconut, this is our pandanus, and this is our native palm. So similar life forms, it makes a lot of sense. So why are these native species sort of clustered down here? There's a couple different ideas. I could talk about that afterwards. But the important thing is the exotics are in a different part of the graph for the most part. And so that made us think, well, if we combine and make new communities with the native species and these exotics, we might be able to use up more trait space and then keep out the highly invasive species. So in the next PCA, we added the invasive species. And you can see that the invasive, sometimes they'll be like a native, okay? Sometimes they'll be like an exotic species, and sometimes they'll be in a new part of trait space that's no other species are there. So they can do anything. They don't follow rules. They can, there's so many, and we have so many of them that they could be in any part of the graph. But our idea is if we combine the native and the exotic, we'll have a better filling of trait space, and hopefully that will keep out some of these highly invasive species. So that's the theory we want to test. So our study site is in Hilo, Hawaii. It's right at the coast here at 30 meters elevation and highly wet, about 3,400 millimeters of rainfall. And it's right here in this urban area. And the reason why this was saved was because it's very rocky, lava flow, very difficult to walk on, not good for agriculture. So that left this little patch of forest here. And what's left of the lowland forests is just remnant patches, mostly in forest reserves, and they're all heavily invaded. We don't have a reference site. We don't know what was there before human contact. The Hawaiian language was all oral. We know the dominant species through chants and songs and legends, but we don't know what the full component of the ecosystem was. And the thing that our previous research, because we've been working at the site for like a decade before we started this experiment, we basically showed that there's no native regeneration. There's native canopy left, but they're not regenerating. And without some kind of management, the site is going to become completely non-native dominated. And this site is mostly these highly invasive species. Actually think that this area was early seeded by early territorial foresters. There was areas nearby in this region of Hawaii Island where I've read about in the 20s, there were fires, and the territorial foresters didn't think that the native species were going to regenerate fast enough on their own. So they had been collecting seeds of highly fast-growing pioneer species. And I'm pretty sure not 100%, but a lot of those species are in this area. And I think that this is potentially a candidate. So we have, if you're familiar with tropical plants, we have Cecropia, which is an archetypical neotropical pioneer, growing right next to Makaranga, which is the archetypical Asian pioneer, like side by side. And we got this whole mix of species from all over the world. The forest, these invasive species there, they're basically on the fast end of the economic spectrum. They're cycling carbon and nitrogen really fast, mostly in the litterfall. These sites have very little soil. Most of the action's going on in this litterfall layer. And they've got a very crowded canopy structure. The Makaranga, you can see there, has giant leaves. It's smothering seedlings. There's no native seedling regeneration, partly because of that and partly because of the light environment. Where the native species, they're slow, conservative in their nutrient cycling, and those forests would have a much more open canopy structure. So in our case study, we defined our restoration goals. We did this trait selection that I mentioned, 15 traits that related to leaf, wood, and reproduction. We put that together. We did that principal components analysis that I showed you. And then we used that to design 4 different treatments, or 4 different communities or teams, we're calling them, each having 10 species. So here's our restoration objectives here. We wanted to increase carbon storage. That was part of our funding. But also resistance to invasion was very important. having native plant regeneration so that these could be self-sustaining systems, having a much clearer understory for better human movement, and low levels of management input. And we used those, we chose 4 core species that were related to carbon management, and we chose species that were either on the slow end of the economic spectrum or not quite as slow, which we're calling moderate in our case. And then we had communities, after we chose those core species, the additional species we chose were either redundant in their traits, so they were clustered together on that principal components analysis graph, or more complementary, they were further apart in trait space. And this is just a visual of this. I don't really have time to go over this in detail, but you can see our 4 treatments here. So we got the slow carbon, complementary and redundant, moderate carbon, complementary and redundant. And we used functional dispersion metric as our functional trait metric to get at that. So then we created the experimental communities, or 4 teams. We cleared the invasive species from the site, and that took us 10 months, almost a year. And our plots are 30 by 30 meters. We cleared 16 of them. That was kind of a full-time job. And then we planted, that took us about a year to plant because not all the plants were ready at the same time. And then we officially started collecting data in January 2014 of these 5 treatments. The other treatment is a control or a reference. That we did nothing to. We did no removal, nothing. We just put a box around it. So this is just some pictures of clearing the plots. So that's what it looked like after we chainsawed and removed all the non-native species. Like, there really was not much left. So these are very impacted systems. This is another picture. And then we would carry out, and that's the Macaranga Mapa, this one's from the Philippines. We would carry out everything off the plot so that we didn't have that organic matter influencing our plot. And sometimes we would have to climb and do some management to get things down that way. And we had lots of groups come out and help us. So we're doing a lot of different measurements. I don't really have time to go into all of these, but we're measuring the tree growth, litter fall to get at productivity, litter decomposition rates, nutrients, reproduction, reseedling regeneration, the resistance to invasion. We want to know how the light environment is changing, what weeds are there. And then we're also keeping track of everything that we do in the field, how much time it takes to do that, so we can make some kind of economic estimates. So we want to know, does this approach work in the short term, and then for the longer term, and can it be sustainable and scaled up? And I don't have all of those answers today, but I'll share what I can. First of all, we have had really high survival over the first 5 years. I'm showing here, but the trend is continuing. And this is really exciting to us. And I think it's partly because we chose our species very carefully. And not all of our species we're expecting to live the entire time. So they're playing different successional roles. So some of them we already know are like kind of winking out because they were there as an early successional species. We've had significant reduction in weeding maintenance. The first couple years we were weeding every 3 to 4 months. So basically we do 16 plots and start over again. We just constant weeding because there was so much in the seed bank that was coming up, and we just had to keep doing that. But after the first few years, we were able to switch to these annual weeding. So everyone in the field still complains about weeding, but it's like, I try to tell them, you should have seen it when we started. You know, it was so much worse. So it's still work, but it's much more manageable now. We can weed in all of the 16 plots if we really were doing it full time in just a couple of weeks. And that's really, really encouraging. Also really encouraging is, and actually this paper is already out now, it's in ecological applications, but is the nutrients. So if you remember, the invasive species are on the fast end, and we replaced it with much slower species. And what's really exciting about this, so the reference has the highly invasive species. This is the 4 treatments combined. but we've reduced the amount of litter fall and the nutrients on the forest floor by greatly. So you decrease the amount of nutrient cycling through the system by 80% or more. And that's really encouraging because it's very hard to take nutrients away once a system has been enriched. So the only way that we could do this is complete replacement with different species. But it's working. We've got now much slower species that are growing slower and cycling nutrients slower, and that's closer to how a native Hawaiian forest should work. Also encouraging, this has all 4 treatments on it, but you can see the lines are all in the same direction. As the species that we planted are growing and the basal area is increasing, the number of weeds is going down. And there's some differences between the treatments that I don't really want to belabor right now, but really encouraging because we're seeing as the canopy develops, the light levels are changing and we're seeing the weed levels go way down. But we're still getting recruitment of what we planted and the native species. So 12 of the 20 species that we planted, we already see seedlings of. So that's also encouraging. It's not so dark that we're not getting them to recruit. So that's really encouraging. That suggests that this could have a sustainable strategy. So the invaded forest is having high rates of litter fall, high LAI. The forest floor is covered with large amounts of litter, big leaves that are high in nutrients. They're smothering seedlings, causing a lot of nutrient inputs to the forest floor, a lack of regeneration in the understory, and then recruitment. And so we're getting this dense non-native understory, and most of the species at the site are highly invasive ones. Whereas with this intentional planting we did with this hybrid restoration approach, we're getting decreased nutrient cycling. That's leading to outplant growth under good conditions. That's creating shade. That's decreasing the weed cover. That's decreasing how much maintenance we need to spend on the plot, and that's decreasing the rate of nutrient cycling. So we're manipulated the light environment and the nutrient environment, and that seems to be having some really positive effects to getting this forest functioning more closer to a native Hawaiian forest. I didn't spend time on the treatments, but I will mention that the 2 moderate treatments in terms of growth and productivity are doing better than the 2 slow treatments. But there are some trade-offs here in that. But the moderate, they were chosen because they do cycle and grow a little faster, are growing faster, and they are reducing weeds. So, but luckily they're not growing too fast. That's the exciting thing. We've got the right mix. They're not growing too fast. We're not getting the regeneration, at least in the short term. Now, in the long term, we'll see what happens. The complementary versus redundant, that's kind of an open question right now. Can't say which one is better. The survival rates are higher in the redundant treatments, but the reproduction, so we do monthly phenology of fruit and flowers, the reproduction is greater in the complementary treatments. So there's a trade-off going on here, and what's going to be better in the long term, not really completely sure. So thinking back on this case study, what we like about it is that this functional trait approach is flexible. We used science to develop the functional traits, put species in trait space, and different decisions can be made depending on different restoration objectives. So if your restoration objectives are fire, reducing fire inflammability, you could choose species that have traits like thick bark and low flammability, low water content, for example, and build communities based off of those traits. If you want to have a community benefit, I forgot to mention this, but a lot of the non-native species that we chose are Polynesian introductions that have been in Hawaii for the last 1,000 years or so. And some of them are fruit trees. We have mango and avocado as well. And many of the Polynesian ones are kukui, mountain apples, things that are used by people, noni. So there, you can add those components to your forest. It could be an agroforest with a functional trait approach and just careful selection of the species. You can use your objectives to choose your species. As I mentioned, we still don't know which treatment works best, but there really is no best. That's kind of what we learned. We naively thought, oh, we're going to prove that the slow complementary is the best, but it really is not the best. It sort of depends on what you're aiming for. And we've had to do a lot of adaptive management along the way. We thought, oh, we'll never use herbicides, but we had to use herbicides on the borders, the buffer zones around the plots, for example, just to make the management a little bit more doable. And we've had surprises. I think the hardest thing since we started this experiment is there have been new insect pest species to Hawaii since we started that we did not know about. So we have avocados, one of our planted species. A few years ago, this avocado lacewing bug has come to Hawaii. Now we also have the Queensland longhorn beetle, the QLB, and it's attacking our kukui, which is a very well-grown species, and now even we've seen it on a few of our ulu, which is our best species. So, that species is like doing so well and producing the most shade, and if that gets attacked by these beetles, who knows what's going to happen? I couldn't plan for that, right? You can't plan for that kind of stuff, even under the best laid scenario, trying to use science to develop these functional traits. And that's the hard part. But if we can do this in Hawaii, you can do this anywhere, because Hawaii really is the most extreme test case, I think. And definitely want to mention, this isn't appropriate for all systems or all places. Mostly native ecosystems might not need this kind of approach for restoration. So it's not a one size fits all. It is a huge investment of labor and money, but we're seeing that we are changing the plant community in lasting ways. And we're also having influence, and didn't talk about it in this talk, we have another project on the leaf litter arthropod community that's developing under the 4 different treatments. And we see 4 different trajectories of the leaf litter arthropod community. We see the same species richness and diversity among the treatments, but different community composition. So the plant functional traits are influencing the arthropod community. And that's actually not that surprising, but again, that's something that restoration ecologists are not always thinking about. Where do you want to get to beyond the plants? So as we're designing these hybrid communities, there's other things to think about that we put together this as just a way to start conversation, but we might want to choose species. Of course, there's the key native species, but these non-native ones, these exotic ones, how do we decide which ones to put in the communities and which not? And there's, of course, all the biological reasons, but there might be some social, cultural reasons, economic reasons as well. And thinking about how to weigh and balance these things is something that we really should be doing, and having these kinds of conversations to decide what species belong, because it's not going to be so black and white that every species we can say this is a bad species and this is a good species. There's nuances here, and we probably should be talking more about them, working collaboratively with communities to help decide how to build these kind of hybrid communities. The other thing that was really exciting that happened with this project is that this environmental lawyer had heard heard about what we were doing from somebody else, and she came and approached us, and she said, I want to rewrite the county code in Hawaii Island for these forest dedications. So there's already forest dedications on the books. If people had more than 3 acres of land and they wanted to, and they had 60% native forest cover, they could get a really good tax, call it a dedication, get a good tax rate for a 20-year period. She said, I want people to get that same credit for doing restoration. So they get credit at time 0, not 20 years later when they have the 60% cover. So we were able to work with the tax code and rewrite it and get it passed for people to get credit for doing restoration, either a native dominated restoration or what is in the bill called the functional forest restoration, which is basically this hybrid ecosystem idea of the native, non-native, non-invasive species. You can also get a tax rate, not as good as the 60% native, but still pretty good. Okay, so stepping back a little bit, been talking about planting trees and using non-native species and native species. And the main message that really we want to get across is got to think carefully about what species to use. And functional traits is one approach, it's not the only approach, but one approach to do that. And these global campaigns that I'm sure you've heard of, like the Trillion Tree Campaign, people just want to go out and plant, and they want to do something and be helpful. But we need to do it carefully and use science to decide what species to plant. Because if we just go out and plant and they don't grow, they don't survive, they don't do well, they're not from the right environment, we're really wasting a lot of time and money. And there is this global bandwagon, even at our site. Like, I talk to managers all the time. They just want to plant because they want to say we planted this many trees. And we really need to think carefully about what we plant and why. I like this quote a lot, that the Anthropocene baselines don't mean that we stop restoring ecosystems. Far from it, we're not giving up. What we're talking about is using the scientific decisions that are guided by scientific evidence to focus on the long-term sustainability, costs and benefits of these different human activities. We are part of the equation. We are the equation, really. We are the ones now that are making these decisions for the world around us, like it or not. And this is important because we live in this world that's becoming increasingly urban. By 2050, 2/3 of the world's populations are going to be cities. And this might be the kind of nature that they see. An urban park or a stream restoration area in Seoul. And that might be the nature that they experience on a daily basis. And we have to acknowledge that is important too. And we need to, even though it's not the wild wilderness that maybe some of us have grown up with and thought about as nature, this is nature. This is nature too. So final thoughts, we have to think carefully about these kind of approaches, use the information we have to design restoration and use the restoration objectives as our tools to decide which decisions to make. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I'm not advocating that we do this all over the world. It is for certain situations potentially a good approach. And so we have to think carefully and balance these different alternatives. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Mahalo.